Decisive Moment is one of, if not the, most significant photo books ever published. It coined a phrase that is of paramount importance in street photography and was considered by Magnum founding member Robert Capa to be a Bible for photographers. The book was created by a photographer of equal significance in Henri Cartier-Bresson. His photos, views on photography, often brash opinions, and overall impact on genres of street and documentary cannot be overstated. But why is the Decisive Moment so important? What makes it stand out? And how can the photos within it help impact your photographic work? This is Street Smarts Volume 34, Deciphering the Decisive Moment. This video is brought to you by Dehancer Film Emulation. While our prints are beautiful and perfectly composed, as they should be, they're not photographs for salons. In the end, our final image is the printed one. The first insight we can take away from the Decisive Moment and Bresson's significance is that photos, in the form of photo books, have the potential to hold more weight than other ways of interacting with photography. Bresson put it this way by saying, "Magazines end up wrapping French fries, or being thrown in the bin, while books remain." Added to that significance is the ability of the photographer to choose the size and sequence of shots on their own, not leaving it up to magazine editors to decide what stays and what goes, which has been a problem cited by many legends of photography, but is an aspect of all of our work that we can relate to digital media that is more relevant in this day and age. Of course, most of us aren't having our work printed in magazines, but the sense of control that is lost through social media is where Bresson's arguments ring true. Through events like the recent backlash over Instagram changing their profile aspect ratios, that has upset countless people who really took the time to curate their pages, only to have that curation completely distorted through changes that were made that were completely out of their control, speaks to the nature of control that needs to be sorted out in the modern world. That could come through physical pressing or releasing designed digital versions of our work that can hold true to our meticulous curation by getting away from the low-hanging fruit of Instagram and other forms of social media where the importance of photography constantly continues to diminish over time. Bresson's passion for the photo book medium came through in his many failed attempts to produce books for others dating back to the early 1930s. He was making these attempts even though photo books were very unusual at the time. It wasn't until 1952 that this book, The Decisive Moment, was published, allowing Bresson's vision for what a photo book could be to finally become fully realized. The first section of Bresson's writing in the book is titled The Picture Story. He opens this section stating, "What actually is a photographic reportage? A picture story? Sometimes there is one unique picture whose composition possesses such vigor and richness, and whose content so radiates outward from it that this single picture is a whole story in itself. But this rarely happens. The elements which, together, can strike sparks from a subject are often scattered, either in terms of space or time, and bringing them together by force is stage management, and I feel contrived. But if it is possible to make pictures of the core, as well as the struck-off sparks of the subject, this is a picture story. The page serves to reunite the complementary elements which are dispersed throughout several photographs." To find this kind of photo, Bresson believes there's no way to really plan for it, and the intervals ranging from seconds to hours to even days could pass before a worthy image presents itself. And in order to catch it, you needed to be alert and open to it with everything in your being at all times. However, he also noted that it was necessary to find the correct balance when shooting photos because, as we all know when taking street photos, it's easy to get carried away and take way too many pictures. Bresson put it this way, "You must stay with the scene, just in case the elements of the situation shoot off from the core again. At the same time, it's essential to avoid shooting like a machine gunner and burdening yourself with useless recordings, which clutter your memory and spoil the exactness of the reportage as a whole." After all of the taking of photos comes a period of reflection when you have to select which of them make the cut. You also have to make selections from memory over what happened on the day of shooting, and if lesser quality overall exists, then you have to ask yourself a litany of questions about what happened and why. These questions include hesitation, uncertainty, if you got close enough to your subjects, whether or not you noted the correct details in the scene, or whether or not you were completely locked into what you were doing. According to Bresson, how sharp your memory is plays a huge role in all that comes after the shooting is complete, because unlike other art forms that can fix, edit, and remake whatever it is they're working on. We cannot go back to what was happening before us in the photo. We cannot develop and print a memory. For photographers, what is gone forever. This video is brought to you by Dehancer Film Emulation, a plugin to help photographers and videographers achieve the look of film through digital means within the following software. For more information on how Dehancer can help you achieve the look of film on your frames by adding authentic and tested looks, compression, grain, halation, bloom, and more, check the link in the description. In this section, Bresson explains that anything in photography can be a subject, and that the medium overthrew painting in its ability to broadcast what we see in the real world. But it's our ability to unravel what is or is not important about any subject that makes it worth photographing. According to Bresson, there are thousands of ways to distill the essence of something that captivates us. Let's not catalog them. We will, instead, leave it in all its freshness. There's a whole territory which is no longer exploited by painting. Some say it's because of the discovery of photography. However it came about, photography has taken over a part of this territory in the form of illustration. He goes on to explain this in context of portraiture and the differences between painting and photography in that regard. That photography captures these things with ease and without the pretentious nature that comes with painting, and that photographers also have the ability to capture the habitats of man, which Bresson believes are a key aspect of capturing who the subject really is. We must respect the atmosphere which surrounds the human being, and integrate into that portrait the individual's habitat. For man, no less than animal, has his habitat. Above all, the sitter must be made to forget about the camera, and the photographer who is handling it. Complicated equipment, and light refractors, and various other items of hardware are enough, to my mind, to prevent the birdie from coming out, and that a better, truer portrait comes from capturing candid photos that contain within them the decisive moment, because reality is lost in staged conditions, or in paid situations where a client wants to knowingly pay to have their portrait taken, since they want to be flattered, and the result is no longer real. Collaboration also played a huge role in bringing this book together. 15 people had a hand in making it what it would become, in terms of financing the project, printing demo versions of the book, and all of the other fine details. One of those fine details was the cover by Matisse. This came about largely because the publishers had already printed several of his books prior to the Decisive Moment. But Bresson had also photographed the painter working in his studio around 8 years earlier, after being asked to do so for a book that was never released, that was supposed to showcase portraits of famous artists of the time. So there was already evidence of an established working relationship. The elements that make up this cover are a sun, mountains, and vegetation, all done in a paper gouache cutout style that Matisse leaned into heavily later in his career. This all comes together through his calligraphy that broadcasts the title of the book, all done in a style that may not necessarily reflect the work of the book, but reflects the work Matisse was making at the time. Matisse stated, "What I dream of is an art of balance, of purity and serenity, devoid of troubling or depressing subject matter, a soothing, calming influence on the mind, rather like a good armchair, which provides relaxation from physical fatigue." In terms of composition, Bresson put together this brilliant phrase: "Photography implies the recognition of a rhythm in the world of real things. What the eye does is to find and focus on the particular subject within the mass of reality. What the camera does is to simply register upon the film the decision made by the eye." Bresson seems to have considered composition to be the most important element of photography, and as much as photographers can hack away at what they've created, Bresson made it very clear in his writings that composition cannot be an afterthought superimposed on an image, because in terms of cropping, it very rarely happens that a photograph that was feebly composed can be saved by reconstruction of its composition under the darkrooms enlarger. The integrity of the vision is no longer there. So many factors come into creating beautifully balanced compositions that Bresson highlights in an equally beautiful manner. In terms of movement within the frame, movement of the photographer to recompose an image, even through movements of the smallest increments, and the elements of knowing when to squeeze the trigger are all aspects of this. To sum this up, Bresson said the photographer must seize upon this moment and hold immobile the equilibrium of it, and that through observing the image later, you'll observe that if the shutter was released at the decisive moment, you have instinctively fixed a geometric pattern, without which the photograph would have been both formless and lifeless. It's well known that Bresson had a lot of issues with color photography. They mostly came from the fact that slow films of his day forced photographers to confine themselves to frames without movement, or the use of strong artificial light. The measures that had to be used to compensate slow film speeds in natural light, through wide apertures, were also not to Bresson's liking. He felt the now desirable cinematic look of wide apertures created cramping that often makes for dull compositions, and that blurred backgrounds in color photographs are distinctly displeasing. Although he still felt color was worth experimenting with, but also felt it was unlikely that he would find anyone capable of producing color photos he would be happy with. In a story that I find hilarious, William Eggleston attested to once having met Bresson. In his words, their encounter consisted entirely of Bresson turning to him at a party, saying, "William, color is bullshit," and exiting the conversation. The rest of his issues with color are also largely the byproduct of how it could be printed in the 1950s, how he felt about the results of those prints, and that he plain and simply, clearly, had a preference for black and white. The collaborative effort is further presented in the layout of the book. There are 4 different templates used throughout, which proves that the publisher was intricately involved in the preparation of the layout. According to Clement Cheroux, writer of a piece titled "A Bible for Photographers" about the Decisive Moment, that much of this video essay is based on. The Decisive Moment is sequenced in 2 parts. The first part consisted of photos taken between 1932 and 1947 that are presented in chronological order with images created throughout Europe, as well as those created in Mexico and the United States. The second section, sequenced in the same fashion, displays images created from 1947 to 1952. The photos here are made in Indonesia, India, China, and the Middle East. According to Cheroux, the division seems to coincide with the founding of Magnum Photos in 1947, and Cartier-Bresson's decision to commit himself exclusively to photojournalism. Bresson didn't really talk about technique as much as you might think, believing that the end result was all that mattered, and that specific techniques didn't really apply to every single photographer. He stated, "Technique is important only insofar as you must master it in order to communicate what you see. Your own personal technique has to be created and adapted solely in order to make your vision effective on film." He believed that the ability to acquire that vision was much more important than any of the techniques that people talk about to no end. All that really mattered to Bresson in the end is working the craft of photography until you personally felt that you had the ability to work with your camera in a way to meet that vision as a kind of reflex that you didn't even have to think about. In my own work, I'm both in love and at odds with this statement on sharpness. Bresson wrote, "I am constantly amused by the notion that some people have about photographic technique, a notion that reveals itself in an insatiable craving for sharpness of images. Is this the passion of an obsession? Or do these people hope, by this technique, to get closer to grips with reality? In either case, they are just as far away from the real problem as those of that other generation that used to endow all its photographic anecdotes with an intentional unsharpness, such as was deemed to be artistic." Bresson also recognized the importance of having a way of getting your work out there and recognized. He held high regard for magazines in their ability to allow him to find an audience. He also disliked them for the fact that they often had the ability to shape the work of photographers, so that the photographer created work that their audience wanted to see, and often came down to the editor of the magazine to decide what did or did not make the cut, but often wasn't really what the photographer desired. So clearly, little has changed in this regard to creating images in hopes of casting a wider net to find a larger audience. He believed exhibitions and books were the best way to avoid this, by leaving complete authorship of the work to the person who created it. The original pressing of The Decisive Moment made it stand out because of how it was produced. The book was significantly larger than any other photo book pressed at the time. It was pressed on higher quality paper, and with binding that was of higher quality as well. And the art of the renowned artist Matisse really set it apart from other work of the same period. The publishers of the book responded to its creation saying, "A publisher only comes across this kind of work once in a lifetime," and that they felt it was one of the most satisfying books they had had the pleasure of making. Even though The Decisive Moment was given high praise and was beloved by those who saw the value of it, the eyes that saw that value were limited. The original pressing was 3,500 copies in the United States. Of that pressing, it sold less than 100 copies per week in the first month of its release. Since then, The Decisive Moment has gone on to impact countless photographers, including some of the greatest of all time. You can find endless quotes regaling their love for it, but one that comes from the photo books of Martin Parr and Jerry Badger says that they consider it to be one of the most distinguished and influential photo books of all time. Joel Meyerowitz states, "Bresson's Decisive Moment is the foundation of street photography. It's about seeing the story unfold before you and capturing it in a single frame. Beyond the photographs, general structure, and construction of the book, another key aspect of its significance is the writing of Bresson that opens the book. Because so little had been produced at the time, or before, that reflected on the thoughts and approaches that went into creating photography. In this writing, Bresson talks about his origins through the use of a box brownie, how painting was the first artistic medium he interfaced with, the impact movies of his day had on him, and the impression Eugene Aget's work had on his young eyes. These writings were edited in the 1980s, when Bresson was attempting to move away from his photojournalistic approach that had consumed him and overtaken his style for a number of years. Prior to the creation of the book, Bresson had produced a lot more work that leaned into the artistic side of photography. The Decisive Moment itself was produced initially when Bresson was completely engulfed in the throes of Magnum and a documentary approach. So much of the work he created that leaned into that artistic approach prior to his time with Magnum was left out of the book, even though it opens with an explanation that his growth as a photographer came when "I was dedicating myself to art with a capital A." Bresson closed the text that opens the Decisive Moment by making this statement: "I believe that, through the art of living, the discovery of oneself is made concurrently with the discovery of the world around us, which can mold us, but which can also be affected by us. A balance must be established between these two worlds, the one inside us and the one outside us. As a result of this constant reciprocal process, both these worlds come to form a single one, and it is this world that we must communicate. But this takes care only of the content of the picture. For me, content cannot be separated from form. By form, I mean a rigorous organization of the interplay of surfaces, lines, and values. It is in this organization alone that our conceptions and emotions become concrete and communicable. In photography, visual organization can stem only from a developed instinct." Thanks to Dehancer for sponsoring this video. If you want to know how to use their plugin to get the look of film on your digital photos and video, check the link in the description. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, keep developing.